That's literally all I have, the tall black man said as he held out a wrinkled $5 bill and three singles beneath the pale glow of a lonely gas station sign on the edge of Highway 41. And for a second, even the wind seemed to stop moving, because nobody watching would have believed that a man willing to give away his last $8 would wake up to a morning that changed his life forever. Elijah Brooks stood in faded jeans, worn work boots, and a charcoal hoodie with the sleeves pushed to his elbows, looking more like a mechanic finishing a late shift than someone carrying quiet confidence in every measured movement. A black touring motorcycle rested awkwardly beside the fuel pumps, while its rider knelt beside the engine with grease on his hands and frustration across his face. The young white biker had already searched every pocket twice before admitting the truth. His wallet was gone, his phone battery had died 20 miles back, and the nearest town sat almost 15 miles away. The cashier inside had politely explained that store policy prevented extending credit, leaving the rider staring at the empty highway as headlights disappeared one after another into the darkness. Elijah watched for only a moment before walking over without hesitation. "How much do you need?" he asked. The rider forced a tired smile. "Honestly, anything helps." Elijah reached into his pocket and counted exactly $8. He looked at the bills for a second, almost amused by the number, then placed them into the stranger's hand. "Get some gas and something to eat." The biker stared in disbelief. "Man, what about you?" Elijah simply shrugged. "I'll figure it out." The cashier glanced through the window, shaking his head as if witnessing the strangest transaction of the week. The rider filled just enough fuel to reach the next city and bought a bottle of water and a sandwich, returning with change that Elijah refused to accept. "Keep it," he said quietly. "You might need it before sunrise." The biker looked at him with genuine gratitude. "At least tell me your name." Elijah smiled, zipped his hoodie against the cool night air, and answered, "Names don't matter as much as choices." A freight truck thundered past, carrying its lights into the distance while silence settled over the station again. The biker climbed onto his motorcycle, but stopped one last time. "I'll find you somehow." Elijah laughed softly, the kind of laugh belonging to someone who expected nothing in return. "Just help the next person who gets stuck." The motorcycle disappeared into the darkness, leaving Elijah alone beside the empty pumps with no cash, no expectation, and only the quiet satisfaction that comes from doing the right thing when nobody is watching. Across the highway, an old American flag fluttered against the night sky, and the cashier watched Elijah walk away toward a dusty pickup truck that looked almost as tired as the road itself, never realizing that before another sunrise 6 black SUVs would roll into that same little town searching for the man who had just given away everything he had. The old pickup truck rattled across a narrow county road just before midnight, its headlights sweeping over empty cornfields and faded mailboxes that leaned with age, and Elijah Brooks drove with both hands resting lightly on the wheel as though nothing unusual had happened, even though his wallet was now empty and the fuel gauge hovered stubbornly above a quarter tank. The little farmhouse waiting at the end of the gravel driveway looked ordinary in every possible way, with peeling white paint, a wooden porch swing that creaked in the breeze, and a single porch light that never seemed to burn brighter than a candle. Mrs. Evelyn Carter, the 74-year-old widow who rented the place to him for almost nothing, looked up from her rocking chair as he stepped onto the porch. "Late night again?" she asked. Elijah smiled and nodded. Someone needed a little help. She noticed the quiet tiredness in his face, but never asked another question because she had learned that the man renting her spare house carried kindness the way other people carried expensive watches. Inside, the kitchen held only a coffee maker, 2 mugs, a loaf of bread, and a handwritten grocery list resting beside a bowl of fresh apples from the backyard tree. Elijah poured a glass of water, opened an old notebook, and reviewed pages filled with sketches, numbers, and community projects instead of luxury plans or vacation ideas. A faded photograph slipped from between the pages, showing a younger Elijah standing beside his father outside a tiny repair shop in Birmingham. His father had once told him, "If money is the only thing you have, then you are poorer than you think." Elijah smiled at the memory before placing the photograph back where it belonged. Across town, a group of men gathered outside a diner laughed as his dusty pickup rolled past. One of them shook his head and said, "That guy always looks like he is barely getting by." None of them knew that Elijah preferred old trucks because his first successful paycheck had purchased one just like it for his father. None of them knew he quietly funded scholarships, repaired playgrounds, and paid overdue utility bills without attaching his name to any donation. Long before sunrise, the house settled into complete silence except for the ticking clock above the stove and the distant whistle of a freight train crossing the valley. On the small wooden table beside his bed rested exactly one object, an inexpensive key ring holding the keys to the pickup and a small brass tag engraved with a single word, integrity. Elijah turned off the lamp and closed his eyes with the calm certainty of a man who expected nothing from the world after doing the right thing. Several miles away, however, lights remained on inside a private estate where an influential family searched for the stranger who had refused repayment. And before the first rays of morning reached the quiet farmhouse, engines would begin starting one after another as a convoy prepared to travel toward the man who believed his $8 had disappeared into the night forever. Morning arrived slowly over Millstone County, painting the empty fields with pale gold light, while Elijah Brooks stepped onto the porch carrying a steaming mug of black coffee and wearing the same faded hoodie from the night before. Nothing around him suggested success or influence. A rusty windmill turned lazily beyond the fence, an old Labrador stretched beneath the porch steps, and the mailbox leaned slightly to one side as if it had been greeting the sunrise for decades. Mrs. Evelyn Carter waved from across the yard while watering a row of tomatoes. "You still fixing the porch after breakfast?" she called. Elijah smiled. "That is the plan." Before another word could be exchanged, a distant sound drifted across the quiet countryside. It was low at first, almost blending with the breeze, then steady enough to make both of them pause. One engine became two, two became four, and within seconds a line of polished black sport utility vehicles appeared on the narrow county road, moving with calm precision instead of speed. Dust rose behind them like a slow-moving cloud, drawing curtains aside all along the neighborhood. Children stopped riding bicycles. An elderly man lowered his newspaper. A woman walking her dog stood perfectly still as the convoy approached the little farmhouse. Elijah took another sip of coffee without changing expression, but Mrs. Carter whispered, "I think somebody is very lost." The lead vehicle rolled to a gentle stop beside the mailbox, followed by 5 more identical vehicles that reflected the morning sun like mirrors. Men and women dressed in tailored suits stepped out quietly, looking around with polite curiosity instead of urgency. One younger assistant checked a tablet and nodded toward the porch. Then the rear passenger door opened. An older gentleman with silver hair, a navy blazer, and polished brown boots stepped onto the gravel road. His posture carried effortless confidence, yet his eyes searched the porch with something closer to hope than authority. He walked forward until he reached the wooden gate and removed his sunglasses. "Good morning," he said warmly. "I am looking for Elijah Brooks." Mrs. Carter looked from the visitor to Elijah and back again, clearly expecting an explanation that never came. Elijah simply placed his coffee mug on the porch rail and stepped down the stairs. "You found him." The older man smiled with visible relief before extending his hand. "My name is William Mercer." Several neighbors quietly repeated the name to themselves because almost everyone in the county recognized it from business magazines and evening news reports. William Mercer glanced at Elijah and then toward the peaceful farmhouse. "My son came home just after midnight and would not stop talking about the man who gave away his last $8. Elijah answered with an easy smile. "I only helped someone who needed help." William looked at him for a long moment before saying softly, "Most people help when they have plenty. Very few help when they have almost nothing, and that is exactly why I had to come here myself." Around them the neighborhood remained perfectly silent, as if every person on the street suddenly realized that an ordinary morning had quietly become the beginning of a story none of them would ever forget. The breeze carried the scent of fresh grass across the front yard as William Mercer slowly lowered his hand after the handshake, studying Elijah Brooks with the kind of careful respect that could never be purchased. Around them the quiet neighborhood had transformed into an audience without anyone saying a single word. Curtains remained slightly open, coffee cups paused halfway to lips, and children stood beside their bicycles wondering why 6 identical black sport utility vehicles had arrived at the smallest farmhouse on the road. William reached into his jacket and removed a folded photograph that had already been handled many times since sunrise. He handed it to Elijah without speaking. The picture showed a smiling young man beside a black touring motorcycle at a family gathering only weeks earlier. Elijah recognized him immediately. It was the stranded rider from the gas station. William noticed the flicker of recognition and smiled. "That is my son, Nathan. He told me every detail." He said a stranger with worn boots and an old pickup truck gave away his last $8 and asked for nothing in return. Elijah looked at the photograph for another moment before handing it back. "I only did what anyone should do." William quietly shook his head. "If that were true, I would not be standing here." Mrs. Evelyn Carter invited everyone onto the porch with the natural hospitality of someone who believed every conversation deserved sweet tea, and within minutes glasses rested on the old wooden table beside flower pots and a weathered lantern. The contrast almost seemed impossible. One of the wealthiest business leaders in the country sat comfortably in a rocking chair, while Elijah leaned against the porch rail wearing faded jeans and an old hoodie that still carried a faint trace of motor oil. The assistants remained respectfully near the vehicles, saying almost nothing. William glanced around the property and smiled. "Nathan thought you lived exactly like this because life had been difficult." Elijah answered with a quiet laugh. "Sometimes simple is a choice, not a consequence." Mrs. Carter looked at him with surprise, because even after 2 years she had never heard him explain himself that way. Across the yard, a delivery driver slowed almost to a stop just to watch the unusual gathering before continuing down the road. William reached into another folder and unfolded several newspaper clippings, placing them gently on the table. Every headline praised anonymous donations that had rebuilt libraries, funded trade schools, restored parks, and paid medical bills across 3 different states. "My research team spent all morning following a trail that never carried your name," William said softly. "Every project led to a different foundation. Every foundation led to another company, and every company quietly traced back to one person." Elijah remained silent while the wind lifted the corner of a newspaper. William looked directly into his eyes and continued. "Nathan thought he met a struggling stranger. Instead, he met a man who has spent years changing lives without asking for recognition." The neighborhood stayed perfectly still, as if the entire street understood that the greatest surprise had not arrived in a convoy of luxury vehicles, but had been living quietly behind a white farmhouse all along. For several quiet seconds, nobody reached for the newspapers resting on the porch table, because the words printed across the pages suddenly carried faces and memories instead of headlines. Mrs. Evelyn Carter slowly adjusted her glasses and stared at one article describing a scholarship fund that had sent hundreds of trade school students into careers they could never have afforded. She looked at Elijah with disbelief. "You started this?" Elijah answered with the same calm expression he had worn at the gas station. "A lot of good people helped make it happen." William Mercer smiled as if he had expected that answer from the beginning. "Every interview says the same thing. Nobody ever sees the founder because the founder refuses publicity." A light breeze moved across the porch, lifting the corners of the papers like silent applause. Across the street, neighbors gathered without pretending they were simply checking the mail anymore. The man who had joked about Elijah looking broke removed his cap and stood quietly beside his truck, realizing he had mistaken humility for hardship. William leaned forward and rested his hands on the weathered table. "Nathan also told me something else. He offered to repay you, and you refused." Elijah nodded. He needed confidence more than he needed another lesson about debt. William laughed softly. "You sound exactly like my father." He reached into a leather portfolio and removed a folded letter written in careful handwriting. "Nathan stayed awake most of the night writing this because he believed you deserved to know what happened after he left the station." Elijah unfolded the page and read silently, while the porch remained completely still. Nathan described reaching the next town safely, finding help, calling his family, and realizing that the stranger who had changed his night never even asked for recognition. At the bottom of the page, one sentence stood alone. "Thank you for reminding me that character is revealed when nobody is keeping score." Elijah folded the letter with quiet care before placing it beside his empty coffee mug. Mrs. Carter wiped away a small tear and smiled toward the flower garden. William noticed the simple brass key ring resting on the table with the word integrity engraved across its surface. He picked it up gently and looked at Elijah. Most executives display awards in glass cases. Elijah looked toward the old pickup parked beneath the oak tree. My father believed one good decision repeated every day becomes a legacy. William nodded slowly, understanding far more than the words themselves. An assistant approached the porch carrying a slim black case, but stopped several feet away until William signaled for him to come closer. The case was placed carefully on the table without explanation. Curious neighbors leaned forward from across the fence, while birds sang from the telephone lines above. William rested one hand on the unopened case and looked directly at Elijah with sincere respect. "I did not drive all the way here to repay $8, he said quietly. "I came because men who choose generosity over convenience are almost impossible to find. And when you find one, you never let the opportunity pass." Every eye on the porch settled on the mysterious case as the quiet country morning seemed to pause, waiting for whatever came next. William Mercer slowly unlatched the black case and turned it toward Elijah, revealing not stacks of cash or polished trophies, but a single cream-colored folder embossed with a simple silver crest that reflected the morning sun. The neighbors stretched quietly for a better look, while Mrs. Evelyn Carter folded her hands in her lap, as though she sensed something far bigger than a business meeting unfolding on her front porch. William slid the folder across the weathered wood and smiled. "For 30 years my family has invested in companies that promise extraordinary returns. Today I want to invest in something much harder to find." Elijah opened the folder and found only one page. There were no complicated contracts, no pages of legal language, and no list of demands. At the top, in bold letters, it read Partnership of Purpose. Beneath it was a proposal to create a nationwide initiative that would fund roadside assistance programs, technical scholarships, community repair centers, and emergency transportation grants for families who had nowhere else to turn. Elijah looked up with genuine surprise. "You built this overnight?" William nodded. "My son could not stop talking about the stranger who spent his last $8 so another person could make it home. He said if one decision could restore his faith in people, imagine what 1,000 similar moments could do." Silence settled over the porch again, broken only by the gentle creak of the old swing. One of the assistants quietly handed William a tablet displaying architectural sketches of community centers that had not yet been built. "Every location will carry the same message," William explained. "No questions asked. No judgment given. Help first." Elijah slowly closed the folder and looked toward the dusty pickup parked beneath the oak tree. The faded paint, the cracked steering wheel, and the old toolbox in the bed suddenly seemed to carry every lesson his father had ever taught him. Years earlier, when the family repair shop struggled through difficult seasons, his father would leave a thermos of coffee and a spare gas can outside the garage every winter because somebody always needed both. He never advertised the gesture and never expected repayment. Elijah smiled at the memory before turning back to William. "This idea belongs to everyone willing to care about a stranger." William extended his hand once more. "Then build it with me." Across the fence, the same neighbor who had quietly judged Elijah the evening before lowered his eyes with embarrassment, realizing that the man he assumed was barely getting by had spent years quietly lifting others without recognition. Mrs. Carter finally laughed through happy tears and said, "I knew he was a good tenant. I just did not know the whole country was about to find out." Elijah accepted the handshake, not with excitement or triumph, but with calm gratitude. And as cameras from passing local reporters began arriving at the end of the road, nobody on the porch talked about $8 anymore because they had all witnessed something far more valuable. The moment simple kindness grew into a promise that could change thousands of lives. By noon, the quiet country road had become the kind of place people slowed down to remember, not because of flashing signs or grand speeches, but because something honest had happened on an ordinary porch. Local reporters stood respectfully behind the fence while cameras captured a black man in faded jeans sitting beside an elderly widow and one of the most recognized investors in America, and the image felt almost impossible in a world that usually measured success by expensive suits and polished buildings. William Mercer accepted a simple glass of sweet tea and smiled as if he had attended far more important meetings in rooms that mattered far less. He turned toward the gathering crowd and spoke with calm certainty. People keep asking why I drove 300 miles for a man who gave away $8. The answer is simple. I was not searching for generosity. I was searching for leadership. The words settled over the yard like the shade of the old oak tree. One young reporter raised a hand and asked Elijah why he never attached his name to the schools, parks, scholarships, or repair programs he quietly funded across the country. Elijah looked toward Mrs. Evelyn Carter, who was carefully trimming a rose bush without paying attention to the cameras, and then answered with the same steady voice he had used at the gas station. The flowers still bloom whether people know who planted them or not. Nobody interrupted him. Even the birds seemed to pause between songs. William nodded with quiet admiration before opening another folder containing a map of the United States marked with hundreds of small blue circles. Every circle is a town where families struggle to reach work, school, or medical care because one unexpected breakdown changes everything. Together we can build places where help arrives before hopelessness. Elijah studied the map and traced a finger across rural counties that rarely appeared in national conversations. He remembered watching his father repair tires for strangers who could only promise to pay later, and his mother packing extra lunches because somebody at school always forgot theirs. Those small acts had never looked extraordinary at the time, yet they had quietly shaped every decision of his adult life. Across the fence, the neighbor who once assumed Elijah was barely getting by finally walked through the open gate carrying a small toolbox. He stood awkwardly for a moment before speaking. "I judged you without knowing you, and I cannot change yesterday. But if those community centers get built, I know how to fix engines and generators. I would like to volunteer." Elijah smiled and accepted the offer without hesitation. One by one, others stepped forward. A retired teacher offered tutoring. A nurse offered weekend health clinics. A mechanic offered free inspections. What began with $8 slowly transformed into a line of ordinary people discovering that generosity could spread farther than money ever could. William looked across the growing crowd and quietly whispered to Elijah, "This is exactly what my son hoped would happen." Elijah watched neighbors become partners and strangers become friends before answering with a gentle smile. Sometimes the smallest gift is simply giving people a reason to believe in each other again. The afternoon sun drifted lower across Millstone County, casting long shadows over the little farmhouse, while folding tables appeared one after another along the gravel driveway, each carried by neighbors who only hours earlier had known almost nothing about the quiet man living among them. Nobody had been asked to help, yet families arrived with homemade pies, folding chairs, toolboxes, notebooks, and ideas written on scraps of paper. Children taped hand-drawn signs to the fence that read "Help starts here," and older residents smiled at the simple words as though they had been waiting years to hear them. William Mercer walked slowly through the gathering, shaking hands with mechanics, teachers, farmers, and retired veterans, realizing that the greatest resource in any community had never been money but people willing to stand beside one another. Elijah Brooks watched from the porch with his hands in the pockets of his faded hoodie, his expression unchanged even as local television crews quietly set up cameras across the road. A young reporter approached and asked what inspired the entire movement. Elijah looked toward the old pickup truck parked beneath the oak tree and answered without hesitation. Need does not care about job titles, bank accounts, or neighborhoods. It only asks whether someone is willing to stop. The sentence spread through the crowd faster than any announcement. Volunteers repeated it to one another while writing plans for emergency fuel vouchers, free repair weekends, and transportation programs for seniors who lived alone. Mrs. Evelyn Carter carried a tray of lemonade from person to person and laughed as strangers introduced themselves like lifelong friends. Nathan Mercer arrived on the same motorcycle that had broken down the night before, this time parking carefully beside the mailbox before walking directly to Elijah. He reached into his jacket and held out a single folded $5 bill and 3 crisp $1 bills. Elijah smiled immediately. Nathan returned the money with quiet respect and said, "I realized something on the ride here. It was never about $8. It was about the chance someone gave me to believe people still show up for each other." Elijah accepted the bills and turned toward a little girl standing nearby with her father. She was collecting canned food for the local pantry after hearing about the morning gathering. Without a word, Elijah placed the same $8 into her donation jar. Nathan laughed. William smiled, and even the reporters lowered their cameras for a moment because the gesture felt too genuine to interrupt. Applause never erupted, yet something stronger settled across the field, a shared understanding that generosity grows instead of disappears when it changes hands. As evening light painted the sky in soft shades of orange and blue, volunteers formed teams, exchanged phone numbers, and planned the first community assistance center with excitement usually reserved for celebrations. Elijah stood quietly at the edge of the crowd while families worked together, realizing that the most meaningful investment he would ever make was no longer measured in dollars, but in ordinary people discovering extraordinary reasons to care about one another. 1 year later, the same country road looked different without losing the quiet charm that made it feel like home, and visitors now arrived from every direction, not to see a celebrity or a mansion, but to visit the first community, first assistance center standing proudly, where an empty field had once stretched beneath the open sky. A simple wooden sign greeted every traveler with words carved deep into the grain, built on $8 and one good decision, and nobody passing by ever hurried past without slowing down to read it twice. Mechanics volunteered beside college students, retired teachers welcomed families with coffee, and local nurses checked on elderly drivers preparing for long trips. Nobody asked for status, income, or explanation. They simply asked, "How can we help?" Elijah Brooks still drove the same dusty pickup truck and still wore the same faded hoodie often enough that first-time visitors mistook him for another volunteer until they noticed the respect in every handshake around him. William Mercer visited every few months, never arriving with speeches, only with new ideas and fresh partnerships that quietly expanded the program into neighboring states. Nathan often parked his motorcycle beside the front entrance, greeting stranded travelers with a smile that had replaced the frustration he once carried on a lonely highway. Mrs. Evelyn Carter became the unofficial grandmother of the center, famous for homemade peach pie and the gentle reminder that kindness always tastes better when shared. The neighbor who once judged Elijah now managed the repair garage without accepting a single paycheck, insisting that giving back had become the best reward he had ever received. Reporters eventually stopped chasing dramatic headlines because there was nothing sensational to discover, only ordinary people choosing one another every single day. One afternoon, a little boy walked into the center holding 8 crumpled dollar bills in his hand and asked if he could donate them to help the next family that got stuck on the road. Elijah knelt beside him and smiled. "Why would you give away all of your money?" The boy looked toward the wooden sign and answered with complete certainty, "Because somebody did it before me." For a long moment, nobody spoke. The wind carried the sound of children laughing across the parking lot, while volunteers loaded emergency kits into waiting vehicles, and an old American flag moved gently above the entrance. Elijah reached into his pocket, touched the small brass key ring engraved with the word integrity, and remembered his father saying that wealth is measured by the number of lives that become lighter because you walked through them. He placed the boy's $8 into the community fund beside thousands of other small gifts and watched the child run back to his family with a smile that could never be purchased. As the sun settled behind the trees, golden lights spread across the building, the old pickup truck, and the people still working long after the cameras had gone home, proving that the greatest fortunes are not counted in bank accounts, but in quiet choices repeated every day, and that sometimes the smallest act of kindness is the beginning of a legacy that changes everything.